you wouldn't get away with how I was brought up now. I mean, you'd get beaten to do your maths, you'd get beaten to do your English, you'd get beaten, and I loved it. I don't say that as a complaint. I love the fact that we were beaten, and anyone of my age, wherever they're from, an Asian background, maybe an Arab background, certainly an African background, you would have been beaten when it came to discipline and education.
How was that imparted on you as a kid, and how did you receive it? And I guess my context of the question is, normally, you hear about these stories of parents, grandparents, etc., of how people behaved, typically in different generations. Let's say materially different time brackets. And if you look at today's world, I guess with things moving a lot faster, I mean, it moves a lot faster now than it did from the 30s to the 50s, 50s to the 70s. But, a hardworking parent of a 10-year-old, 15-year-old kid today, who's going to be someone who was, let's say, born in the 80s, that kid born in the mid to late 2000s is probably laughing at that parent now, because we're in such a materially different world. And they kind of, I guess, they get lazy, and it's like, oh, my dad did this, that, and the other, but I live in a different world now. I guess, obviously, you're a lot older than I thought you were, so
Yeah.
maybe that's half the answer to the question. But it's very rare, I find, that these immigrant parents, these ultra hard-working parents who basically, came from nothing and built everything on just grit, desperation, desire,
Yeah.
that never gets passed on to the kids. They know that's what the dad was like or the mom was like, but they weren't born in Nigeria into poverty. They were born in England, or et cetera, et
No,
cetera.
you're right, actually. It's almost like comfort breeds complacency, isn't it, to a certain extent? But I think what we benefited from was the fact that we still grew up quite poor, because my dad was sort of asset rich, cash poor.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for that is because of what my parents experienced. They had this kindness, which is probably not the best thing. Oh God, that sounds horrible, me saying it, but I think to be an entrepreneur and be that kind is probably not the best thing. It's a bit like you having a business and giving your customers things for free. What they did was let people live in their properties for free. Because everyone's got a sob story, right? Oh, I can't afford to pay the rent, blah, 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 blah. And because my parents struggled, they always had a soft spot for that, and people took advantage. So we kind of grew up poor because of that. Even though we were told we had all of this and all of that, it was still poor. But because we grew up poor, I still had that sense of what my dad had. I didn't have this silver spoon. I went to not the best school. I was around kids who didn't grow up with fathers, for instance, kids that got into like gang stuff and all the rest of it, which was a good grounding for me, because it meant that I really had to work hard for myself in order to make it. I couldn't just rely on my parents.
And how did you treat your education, or how were you made to treat your education by your parents? Obviously, from a guy who excelled in his education, was that something that was pushed onto you, that you must go to school, you must do
Hell
well?
yeah. I mean, in my culture, you wouldn't get away with how I was brought up now. I mean, you'd get beaten to do your maths, you'd get beaten to do your English, you'd get beaten, and I loved it. I don't say that as a complaint. I love the fact that we were beaten, and anyone of my age, wherever they're from, an Asian background, maybe an Arab background, certainly an African background, you would have been beaten when it came to discipline and education. And I loved it. It was all I knew, and I loved learning, Like, we had these encyclopedias. I don't know if you remember Encyclopedia Britannica. How old are you?
I'm 43, but
Did you look bloody good yourself? Saying I look good. I thought you were in your 30s. Bloody hell, you got the Fountain of Youth or something in your backyard.
We used to have them. We had Encyclopedia Britannica and Kids Encyclopedia. The kids ones were the red ones,
guys weren't messing around, yeah.
and
we had that one,
the
yeah.
adults were the black ones. Yeah,
It's funny you said that. I didn't realise that.
yeah.
Oh, we had the red ones then. Was it kids?
Sure,
That was some smart bloody kids then, because that was full of some meaty stuff.
I'm pretty sure
I
it
don't
was.
think that there was a kids version.
There was
But you could be right. I don't know.
There was definitely two. I'm going to.
It was meaty stuff then for kids, because kids wouldn't get that nowadays.
I mean, it's mad that the encyclopedias don't even exist. I mean,
I know. Now we got Google. It's weird. We got Google, but I mean, this generation seems to have less interest in knowledge than our generation, who had to rely on encyclopedias. It's kind of weird.
I'm pulling them up now.
Was it? You might have been right, actually. Was it not children's?
You can buy
Britannica?
You can buy a full set of them on eBay for 199 quid.
I'm going to get that, dude. 'Cause, do you know what? That was a central part of why I became so fixated on creating something that had a legacy to it. Because I'd look in the encyclopedias and I was fascinated with everything in there, from like Galileo, like think of every inventor you can even think about. Oh wow. Oh,
Good
that's
ones.
like different. Yeah, I like that. So I was obsessed with like Newton and everyone you can imagine back then, like these people who, Beethoven, for instance, everyone that left a legacy that reverberated through time. It's my favorite phrase. And I wanted to be in there. And back then, you didn't really see anyone that looked like you. You know, me growing up as a young black kid in Notting Hill, you weren't in an environment where you saw people that looked like yourself that did well. And you certainly didn't see that in encyclopedia. There were no historical figures. I mean, it was years later that you learn about kingdoms like Mali and people like that. But at that time, you just did. And I was thinking, one day I want to be in this encyclopedia. Little did I know that Google would make it obsolete, but still at the time. And because my dad had a dream and he'd made it, like I said, I had this naivety of I just need to dream it. And it was almost an early form of manifestation. And one of my earliest dreams, because I started to develop a love of music, was I wanted to be on top of the pops. So when you talk about the whole thing around education, yes, it was beaten into me, and I loved it. I loved learning with I mean, I would devour any book that I saw. I would devour, and I sort of went away from sort of academia and more into the arts, just because I'm in Notting Hill, and if you know about Notting Hill, it's such a cool, creative, arty place. I mean, everyone I think has lived there at some moment in time. Jagger, Bowie, so it's got a real musical energy to it. And then you got the Notting Hill Carnival, which every year just brings out more of that. And growing up Nigerian, of course, it's like parties, 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 parties every single weekend. So I mean, even from my mother's womb, I was probably dancing and letting my body groove. So I had this massive amount of education. I had this real sense that it was possible because my dad did it. And then I had a love of music growing up in one of the most creative, incredible neighborhoods of London. And I developed that my first love, which was one day I'm going to be on top of the pops. And so together with my brother, as I got a bit older, I would just devour music wherever I could. I mean, we are too poor to have things like piano, but at school, I'd always play the piano. And I learned to play it by reading Guitar Tab, which is a very poor way to learn the piano, right? We didn't have the luxury of piano lessons, but I learned guitar tabs because it was easier. Guitar tabs didn't have music notif. It was just G minor or A sharp chords, whatever it might
Yeah.
be. And so I developed a real love of music and a real love of education. And, obviously as time went on, I went to university, got a degree in advertising. And I mean, I'm sure we're going to talk a bit more about some of that stuff. But yeah, my dad was definitely my very first hero as far as being a businessman and entrepreneur is concerned, because for him to come over here absolutely penniless, to invest in property and now to be worth several millions as a black man as well in the UK, in those days. I mean, come on, I was so blessed. I was so blessed because most people don't have that kind of role model, especially young black boys growing up in a working class way. I mean, even to this day, I get stopped every single day, especially by young black guys, because they watch me on The Apprentice and they're just so proud of me. And that blows me away because I forget that not everyone looks at life like me. I have this naivety of if you dream it, you can do it. But other people almost sometimes need to see someone that looks like them that they can relate to, and then it's more possible.